Once Bitten, Twice Die, Book 1 from the Blood of the Infected series by Antony J. Stanton. Narrated by Antony J. Stanton. Chapter 1. This is the end. The thought was only fleeting. In reality, the end had been and gone a long time before. Sinner had warned him not to do anything stupid, but here he was fighting for his life. What he really should have done was to just give up and let death claim its prize. If he had known what the future held in store for him, he may well have accepted the inevitable. He may have sought a more agreeable means of dying, something a little less brutal, perhaps something that did not jeopardize the lives of others. Had he been aware that he himself was soon to become a vicious murderer, he might not have battled quite so hard. But Abbott was not gifted with foresight. At that moment, all that consumed him was trying to stay alive just a little longer. Besides, what kind of death can any one person choose for their first experience of it? His aggressor advanced with surprising vigor. Abbott was forced back onto the table. He was fit, well-trained, and considerably larger than the other. Nevertheless, he found himself unable to contain the onslaught, the triumph of wrathful incognizance over strength and experience. Only certain kinds of demise permit the luxury of reviewing your existence as it flashes in front of your eyes in glorious technicolor. Some keep you fully engaged and struggling for salvation until the very end. In such cases, even a brief perusal of your life in black and white is asking too much. Abbott's situation fell firmly into the latter category. He frantically grasped the lunatic's forearms. His assailant, however, possessed unnatural surges of power, dredged up from his inner demons. A trail of phlegm and a guttural snarl escaped his lips. Hands clawed and teeth snapped. He lunged repeatedly at Abbott's face. He was virtually within reach now. Abbott dodged his head to the side with a grunt. He tried to get a knee under his attacker's body, but the man was writhing too much. It was just not possible. Yet, without doing so, he knew he would not be able to hold him off much longer. His strength, along with his hope, was fading fast. Abbott was flecked with spittle. The stench of warm, rancid breath was overpowering as their heads slowly came together. Some of the man's teeth had rotted and fallen out, leaving open sores in blackened gums. His face was mottled with an unhealthy purple tinge. It was covered with scabs and flaking skin. Red lines, like those of a habitual drinker, covered his cheeks. His eyes were bulging and bloodshot and darted about as though without focus, yet the most chilling factor was the absolute lack of perception. The pupils were dilated and blank like those of a shark. It was as though he was just lashing out blindly. If the eyes are a window to the soul, then these particular portals looked out onto a vista of pure hell. And then there was the rage, unprovoked yet wanton and plentiful. There was just an overpowering urge to kill. Abbott's arms burned. His attacker still showed no sign of tiring. If anything, he grew even more frenzied, and ironically, that may have provided an invaluable reprieve. Death took a reluctant step back and waited, denied its reward for now. As the man thrashed about, there was a loud crack. The back legs of the table splintered. The pair were sent tumbling. Abbott hit the floor hard. Pain shot through his shoulder and he was winded, but he managed to slip a leg between the two of them. Deftly, he launched the man over his head, slamming him against the wall. This was his moment to save himself. This was his one chance to live. If the other reacted more quickly, then he would surely be dead. He rolled and scrambled to his feet, grabbing at whatever he could reach. A heavy pewter candlestick discarded nearby. He swung as his opponent started to rise. It struck with a thud across the temple. The force jarred right up through Abbott's arm, but somehow his adversary did not go down. As he leapt, Abbott backed up and swung again and again. Each blow solidly found its mark, leaving deep red gashes. The man sagged to his knees, a trail of blood at his nostril. He flailed forwards with an enraged gargling as the liquid dripped from his chin. Abbott struggled to maintain balance. He desperately hit out once more and cracked the skull right on the top. This time it made a different sound, more hollow and decisive. This time the candlestick embedded itself. This time, the man went down. Abbott sank to the ground. The body lay at his feet with one leg twitching disturbingly. A small pool of viscous blood gradually took shape around the head, forming a macabre halo. Abbott gulped down air as his hands started trembling. He was in an upstairs room with bookshelves lining 3 of the walls. The house was identical to all the others in the street, and presumably, in most, this would have been a bedroom. However, the owners of this one, almost certainly dead, or worse, had turned it into a reading room. The shelves were made of cheap knotted pine, and books were lying on the veneer flooring, torn and discarded. He noticed that only one tome remained standing, the Bible. As he sat trying to regain composure, the violence of the confrontation made it hard to focus. He found himself fixing on irrelevant details, a mist enshrouding his mental faculties. He looked around vaguely for a matching candle holder. These would probably have come as a pair. The random notion surfaced that it was just like a scenario from Cluedo. Colonel Mustard, or, in this case, Sergeant Matteo Abbott, in the library with a candlestick. He wondered again where Cinna was, as he should have arrived a long time before. It was most unlike him to screw up. Only now did he start to appreciate that something had gone badly wrong. Sergeant Abbott had left the relative safety of RAF Headley Court earlier that afternoon, but later than was prudent. Headley Court was a small military station to the north of London, near the town of Bishop's Stortford. It was a medical establishment specialising in rehabilitation, as well as research and training. Abbott had been driven by Private Giuseppe Campos in convoy with another Land Rover carrying Sergeant Cinna and Private Rohith, both soldiers from the Gurkha Regiment. They had gone to a supermarket and had carefully and quietly loaded shopping trolleys with bottled water, tinned food, cleaning products, and other essential supplies. Cinna kept an anxious vigil over the 3 of them throughout. Campos had become agitated as the afternoon progressed. "Sarge, you know my parents live around here, don't you?" He looked at Abbott through veiled eyes. Abbott replied cautiously, not looking forward to the next few words. Cinna had heard the comment too. He stood in the aisle a few metres away, gripping his SA-80 assault rifle as he scanned all around them, listening for sounds of anyone approaching in the gloom. Their afternoon had been uneventful so far, although the threat of attack always lingered ominously. To let one's guard down meant courting death. They all knew it, the RAF station had experienced it, and they did not want to add to the obituaries. Cinna flashed Abbott a look with a hint of a warning, but there was also empathy in his expression. Abbott respected Cinna. He was a fastidious and dedicated soldier, but had a big, compassionate streak running through him. He was charismatic, and the troops took to him well. "Sarge, what do you think?" Campos took a step nearer to Abbott, his hands fidgeting. "Is there any chance that we could swing by my house, just for a moment? I mean, they're almost certainly dead, but I'd really like to make sure, just in case, you know?" Abbott rubbed his chin and avoided looking at Campos, whose pleading eyes drilled into him. "Sarge?" Abbott glanced at Cinna, who just shrugged and looked away. All right. We'll drive over to their house when we're done here, but we're not getting out of the landy. We can beep the horn a few times, maybe shout out of the window, but we're not getting out. Is that clear?" he answered sternly. But Campos was no longer listening. His face had lit up, and he was chattering away to himself. He was a nice lad, always cheerful and keen to help as best he could. Abbott knew how much Campos thought of his parents and how much he idolised his father. For a moment, Abbott felt a flush of bonhomie. Even in this terrible world that they all barely existed in now, he had been able to brighten someone's day, albeit briefly. Sergeant Cinna turned to Abbott with a grin, sharing in the moment. "I think we're just about done here. Why don't you two poke off and we'll catch up with you at the house?" Abbott's smile vanished as he was jerked back to reality. He was aware that every second spent off base exposed them to significant risk. And whilst he wanted to help Campos find his parents, if at all possible, he did not want to put himself or his colleagues in any greater jeopardy than was absolutely necessary. "Are you sure?" he asked with a frown. "Wouldn't it be better if we waited and went together?" "This is the last lot of stuff to chuck in the landy. It'll only take a mo and we'll be right behind you losers. I'd rather we get back to the station as fast as possible, and certainly before sunset. Sunset was at 6:13. It was now 5:42. That did not leave them much time. Abbott was about to argue until he saw the look on Campos's face. He shrugged. Sure. Okay. We'll get cracking then. And thanks. This means a lot to the boy. Yeah, I kind of gathered that, Sinner laughed. Go on, just stay in radio contact and don't do anything stupid, okay? Anything stupid. Did that include allowing Campos to persuade him it was safe to leave the vehicle after there was no reply to their shouting? Did that include going into the house, even though Abbott knew it was lunacy to be confined in such close quarters? If only Sinner knew how stupid he had been since last they spoke. Abbott now shuddered, and the makeshift weapon slipped from his grip as he passed a hand across his face. Only then did he notice the throbbing in his arm. It was a small bite mark. The skin was barely broken, hardly worth mentioning, really, with just a slight prick of blood. He could tell where the man's teeth had fallen out, with the marks on his arm representing those that remained. He rubbed his flesh ruefully and pulled the sleeve down. As he sat hugging his knees to his chest, the temptation was to remain there, hidden and safe from the horrors of the outside world, horrors that were never far from one's conscious thoughts, horrors that temporarily submerged when one was preoccupied, but then resurfaced like a bloated corpse. However, he knew he could not stay there. It was hard to find motivation, but he had to leave the house, and fast. He rebuked himself for his inactivity. Come on, get moving, soldier. This is no time to rest. Wearily, he rose and crossed quietly to the door. With every step, the floorboards creaked. He stopped and held his breath, listening for sounds. The house was still. Evidently, the scuffles had not attracted any further unwanted attention. Yet. He drew his gun and flicked the safety catch off, taking no chances this time, then raised his radio and operated the press to talk button. Sinner, this is Abbott. Do you read? Nothing. Sinner, this is Abbott. Come in. Deathly silence. Odd, he thought. The only explanation he could think of was that they had got confused and gone straight back to base. Ordinarily, Abbott might have been angered by this. Ordinarily, alarm bells might have started to ring, but now he just clipped the radio back onto his belt, rubbed his arm, and continued, survival mode dictating his actions. He paused on the landing and listened again, then slipped quickly down the stairs. Campos's body lay at the bottom, his head twisted unnaturally to the side where his neck had snapped. His eyes and mouth were open in the grimace he bore as he was savaged and fell. Abbott felt for a pulse, but he already knew there would be none. Above him on the wall was a photo, a portrait in a wooden frame. It sidetracked Abbott, and he stared at it for a moment. It was a typical family pose of much-loved mother and idolized father with their arms around each other's shoulders. A boy, Private Giuseppe Campos, of perhaps only 17 years old, was sandwiched between them, kneeling down as though in the stance of a football team. Campos was not much older now and had hardly changed since that photo was taken. He reflected on the photo a moment, the familiar ease with which the three of them embraced each other, and thought with sadness for a moment of his own parents. Now, however, was not the time for reminiscing. There would be time for that later, he thought, although in this he was wrong. He was conscious that it was not level and dimly aware that normally his fastidious nature would have prompted him to straighten it, but not today, not now. Abbott had served in 3 war zones and accumulated several medals for his efforts. He had witnessed death, both amongst his own troops and the enemy, and was on first-name terms with it. Recent dealings, however, were all very new and strange. Perhaps in times before he might have been more traumatized by this most recent attack, but now he steeled himself, shook off the mental fog, and moved with the intent of someone focused on staying alive. The prospect that death has not yet left the building, but is somewhere nearby, sharpening his scythe and having a quick breather before returning to the scene of the crime, does wonders to one's motivation. He looked down at Campos's lifeless body. Sorry, pal. Heaven knows you're better off where you are now. He crossed himself, although since very recently he no longer believed in God. He reached down and took Campos's holstered pistol and dog tag. It did not escape his attention that, like himself, Campos had not even had time to draw his weapon. Suddenly there was a creak from upstairs which made him freeze. He hoped it was merely the sound of the house groaning in the wind, rather than his attacker walking to the top of the stairs. Silence returned. In fact, there was an eerie stillness in general. There were no noises of traffic or any kind of life from outside, none of the background chatter that one normally expects from living in an urban area. Creepy. At that moment, a car alarm sounded, screaming out into the quiet with its shrill tones, and the noise was even more alien in this world devoid of the usual detritus of life. The house was in disarray. Furniture lay overturned and broken. There was smashed crockery on the carpet, and a bloody stain smeared down one wall. A stale smell pervaded throughout. With a nervous glance at the stairs, Abbott moved to the front door. He looked at the sky, although, in truth, the weather did not matter. The weather would never be of consequence again, just as the date no longer meant anything. He was more interested in the time of nightfall. The sun was scuttling quickly westwards, unwilling to loiter, and neither was Abbott. He really did not want to be off station and alone when it got dark. The road, although gloomy and unlit, was quiet. There was no movement until a dog ran past, its tongue lolling out. It seemed unconcerned and happy, as though everything was normal, and for that he envied it. The dog stopped briefly to scratch and sniffed at a wall before continuing. Abbott slipped out and moved guardedly towards his Land Rover. Glass crunched beneath his feet, and he tried to walk as quietly as possible, checking all around him as he went. It was predominantly a residential street, and there were signs everywhere of hysteria. The gate to Campos's house was off its hinges, rubbish was strewn all around, and the windows in many adjoining buildings were smashed. Old newspapers danced in the breeze like modern-age tumbleweeds, and there was a distinct smell of burning. On the garden path, he noticed the head from a plastic Barbie doll. In the garden next door was a child's plimsoll, lying in a patch of dried blood. The shoe was small and pink, and Abbott had to force himself to look away and not think too deeply. There was still no sign of Sergeant Sinner and Private Rohith. At the gate he looked all around and felt confident that he was not being watched. Not for the first time that day he was wrong. Not for the first time that day Lady Luck was smiling upon him more than he would ever know. He got into the vehicle, and with shaking hands he started the engine. He was well aware that there would be questions on his arrival back at base. He could imagine the anger as to why they had been out alone with no backup. He had no answers, no good reason for their actions, other than the emphatic plea of a young man desperate to find his parents, a plea that he himself could well understand. On the short drive back, he could not help but notice various corpses arranged in their final resting places. He had to swerve around a body lying in the middle of the road. Another, an elderly gentleman in a pinstripe suit, was slumped against the front door of a house as though asleep. Abbott saw them all but felt nothing. It was as if the attack upon himself, or perhaps the proximity of his own demise, had left him emotionless and unable to empathize. By the time he arrived back at the base, the shock and exertion of the violence and the effect of Campos's death were starting to affect him. He felt exhausted. Sweat had dried on him, giving him a chill, and his arms and back ached as though he had flu. Corporal Bannister from the Army Security Regiment at Headley Court was smoking in the guardroom. He had been sat on duty with his feet up on a table for the last half hour, his green military shirt crumpled and open at the neck, more than uniform standards would normally permit. His rifle rested on the desk in front of him, pointing into the distance down the empty road leading to the station. He allowed the smoke to escape from his lips, slowly bleeding away until recapturing it in his nostrils, a trick he had admired in an old movie featuring Humphrey Bogart and an attractive lady whose name he could not remember. With his spare hand, he casually played with his cigarette lighter. It was in the style of a metallic Zippo, but had the caricature of a naked woman on the side, a tacky souvenir from a recent beach holiday with mates. Colleagues had teased him for possessing such a crass object, but he liked the fact that the lighter was a vague source of controversy, and rarely cared for other people's opinions anyway. From the main road, any car that turned to enter the base had approximately 40 metres to drive up to the guardroom. When he saw Abbott's Land Rover swing into the approach lane, he took his feet off the table, but did not extinguish the cigarette, and remained leaning back in the chair. As the sergeant slowly brought the car to a halt, he flicked a length of ash on the floor. Slowly he got to his feet and wandered out to unlock the gates. "How was your day at work, honey?" he began, as Abbott wound down his window, then stepped back in surprise and cursed. "You look dreadful," he spat out. Abbott shot him a glance, but said nothing. He took in the decline in uniform standards and the informal, almost disrespectful way in which Bannister addressed him. The fact that he was smoking whilst on guard and had been slow to open the gates. However, he could not muster the enthusiasm to say anything, something that Bannister would later recall as having struck him as out of character. "Where are Sinner and Rohith?" "Dunno. They haven't got back yet?" Abbott asked listlessly. "No. Hey, where's Campos?" Bannister asked with real concern in his voice now. "Dead." "What?" Bannister covered his mouth with a hand as he digested the news. "How?" From beyond the guardroom they heard a bellowing. "Bannister, are Abbott and Sinner back yet?" Station Commander Group Captain Tristan Denny approached the gates, but stopped short as soon as he saw Abbott. "Good Lord, what on earth happened? Where's Campos? Are you okay?" Not sure which question to answer first, Abbott just repeated himself in a monotone voice. "Dead." Denny stood for a moment staring as he too processed the information, and then deflated a little in the shoulders and back as though certain sections of his body had been punctured. His reaction was similar to Bannister's. He brought his hands together in front of his face like a monk deep in prayer and closed his eyes. Then they flickered open and fixed nervously on Abbott. "You don't look so good yourself. How are you?" "I'm okay, sir. A little tired, but otherwise all right." Only then did Denny realise that the other Land Rover was not there. He looked confused. Bannister noticed the vein in his temple stand out as he started to go a little red in the face. "Where are the others? I thought 2 cars went off base." Abbott found it hard to meet his scowl. We got separated, sir. I thought they should be back already." "Separated?" Denny was incredulous. "How on earth did that happen?" "It was Campos, sir. His parents live close to where we were looking for supplies, so we just popped by to check if anybody was there. We only took a moment, and Sinner was supposed to come and join us, but he never showed up." Abbott trailed off as the station commander threw his hands in the air. Overreacting again, Bannister thought. Finally, Denny took a deep breath, heaving his shoulders up and forcing himself to calm down. He turned away from the 2 soldiers and rubbed his head frantically for a moment. "Look, this is really unacceptable," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I thought we had introduced procedures to avoid this kind of event. Totally unacceptable, but that can all wait. The important thing now is the whereabouts of Sinner and Rohith. I need you to show me exactly where you left them and where you arranged to rendezvous. Then drop the Land Rover at MT, but I want you in my office later for a debrief." Bannister stood fidgeting awkwardly. His gelled brown hair made his naturally impish features seem decidedly more boyish and mischievous than his 28 years would imply. His dark eyes, ever alert and restless, darted about anxiously. As Abbott drove away, Denny did not even acknowledge him at first, but stood swaying slightly with his head bowed. A light moan escaped him. He had never looked as tired and defeated as at that moment. His ginger hair was greying and slightly unkempt, and smudges under his eyes indicated how badly he was sleeping, yet his uniform was still immaculately pressed and his army boots were gleaming. "How long has he been back?" Denny finally asked. "He just arrived that minute, sir." "He looked terrible." "Yes, sir." So do you, Bannister thought. In truth, they all looked haggard nowadays, and the stresses were beginning to tell on Denny more than most. "Radio Captain Lewis, and tell him to meet me in my office in 5 minutes." Denny turned and stalked away from the guardroom. Bannister was left feeling vulnerable and alone as he searched up and down the road for any sign of Sergeant Sinner before going to recheck the padlock. He sank back into his chair, lit another cigarette, and nervously picked up his weapon. He looked out at the setting sun, half veiled by clouds. He often thought that the most beautiful sunsets he had ever seen were in England, the frequently overcast sky lending itself to dramatics. The red shafts of light poked through and illuminated the cloud from beneath, as though the roof of the heavens was aflame. Although tonight it felt to Bannister more like hell itself was boiling over, spewing forth its contents unto the earth. He was morbidly becoming a little more resigned to the prospect of his own fatality with the passing of each day and every death. He sat staring at the outside world beyond the safety of the fence as the shadows lengthened and gathered around him. "Bugger!" Captain Thomas Lewis cursed as he left Group Captain Denny's office. The news was bad, really bad. Another soldier killed, and the whereabouts of 2 more unknown. As well as that, the thought of going out now, as twilight shrouded the station, was not one that he relished, and the nonchalant way Denny had mentioned it made his mood even worse. Still, he would have it no other way. As second in command on the base, if 2 of his men were missing, then he would damn well go and find them. He was certainly not going to go out alone, though. He wanted 3 of his best soldiers with him. They would most likely go unmolested, but you never knew. In less than 5 minutes, they were driving away from the station, with Corporal Bambarak from the supply and logistics section hastily locking the gates behind them. Captain Lewis turned to look back, as he always did, as the protection of RAF Headley Court receded out of reach. He was from the Royal Artillery and had been at Headley Court for only 6 months. However, he had served in the army for 10 years, and like many of his colleagues, a lot of that time had been spent in Northern Ireland, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and thus he had a fair amount of frontline experience. Stay alert, lads. Let's not get our names on the list of deceased for today. We don't want what happened to Parsons to happen to us, do we? With the news of Private Campos's death and the other 2 still missing, the atmosphere in the car was sombre. Sat in the back, even Bannister's normally incorrigible manner had been quietened. Beside him sat the dark, hulking mass of Lance Corporal Dean Millington, a black man-mountain from the Army Security Regiment, and a reassuringly solid soldier to keep handy. Driving them away from safety was his most senior sergeant, a Scot named Garrick Stradling. He had served for more than 20 years in the army and was one of the most experienced men on the station. He was fairly short and stout, with a large chest and belly and thick arms. His gruff, cynical attitude to life in general reflected perfectly his physical appearance, and he seemed to have an idiom of doom for every occasion. He had an enormous auburn moustache and was balding on top with a wispy comb over at the front. Although Lewis found him stubborn and uncooperative at times, he was definitely someone to take along on just such an excursion. "Where to, boss?" Sergeant Stradling asked. Captain Lewis had a map with the locations marked on it by Abbott. As Cinna had not arrived at the house of Campos's parents by the time Abbott had left, it seemed reasonable to start at the supermarket. The onset of nightfall shielded their eyes from the worst of the scenes of pandemonium that now littered the roads, scenes that these 4 soldiers were all too familiar with and were grateful not to be reminded of yet again. Occasional creatures scurried out of their way as Sergeant Stradling whisked them wordlessly through the streets to their destination, hands gripping the wheel tightly as he scanned their path. They arrived at the store, and Stradling warily brought the Land Rover to a halt. No one spoke. Lewis peered out, trying to see any movement or sign of their comrades. "Odd," Stradling said. "Huh?" Lewis turned to see what had caught his attention. Stradling pointed. Near the entrance to the store was the Land Rover. "They never left." "So they're here somewhere," Bannister said as he leaned forwards from the rear. "Let's go get him, I say, then get the hell out of Dodge. Being away from home gives me the willies." Okay, just go easy," Lewis frowned. "There's something not right about this. Why is their car still here? Why haven't they left yet? They should have been back at Headley Court a long time ago." He spoke into his radio. "Sergeant Cinna? Private Rohith?" But there was no answer. He turned to his sergeant. "Before we get ourselves into any trouble, do the honours, please." Stradling honked the Land Rover's horn a few times, destroying the evening hush and making them all uneasy. Attracting such attention when away from the security of the station was never a wise idea, but in this case Lewis considered it inevitable. Only silence answered them back. "I guess there's nothing for it then," Lewis said. Tentatively, they all got out of the vehicle, brandishing their SA-80 rifles before them. "Stradling, bring up the rear and keep checking your 6, Lewis whispered. "Let's keep it as quiet as possible." "But he's only just been blasting out the Landy's micking horn," Bannister muttered to Millington, earning him a scowl from Stradling. They examined the other Land Rover, but it gave no clues. The rear had been half-loaded with supplies, and all seemed completely normal. Lewis motioned towards the entrance of the supermarket, and the four shuffled forwards, with Stradling casting nervous glances over his shoulder. By now, night engulfed them, and with no lighting, the store was in total darkness. They crept along, torches probing back and forth. There was a putrid smell of decaying food, mingling with the stale funk from the dirt of animals. The aisles were littered with goods that had been knocked off shelves. Some had split, spilling their guts, making every step crunch painfully. At the end of the first aisle, Lewis raised a hand to bring them to a halt. They clustered together, breathing rapidly but as quietly as possible. Cautiously, he called out into the threatening blackness. "Sinner? Rohith?" Nothing. They proceeded down a second aisle. It was when they got to the third that they encountered something strange. The produce displays had been absolutely decimated. The shelves had been toppled, and packets and cans strewn all around. Something serious had happened here. This was not the action of marauding animals. The shelf units were substantial. To knock one over would have required considerable force, to break one even more so. Lewis looked back to ensure the others were aware of the potential significance. Still, there was no sign of either missing soldier as they stood amidst the mess. He scanned around, but it was Stradling who noticed it and gave a hiss. "What is it?" Lewis asked. Stradling just pointed. Down, at their feet. Blood. They were standing in a pool of it, lots of it. It must have stretched for several meters along the floor and was splattered on the shelving. "Whew! Bugger me," Bannister explained with a low whistle. Frantically now, they widened their search, but there was no sign of the soldiers anywhere, just the ominous streak of blood that looked like something or somebody had been dragged through it, smearing a gory trail along the aisle until it suddenly stopped. There were no bodies or indications as to the source of it. As they stood, bewildered, back at the scene of so much carnage, Lewis was no closer to an explanation. He could not determine from where the blood had come, or why the smudged trail ended so abruptly. "What the hell happened?" Lewis asked. "If they've been killed, where are the bodies? And if they haven't been killed, then where are they?" It was all too surreal, too inexplicable. He could not shake the feeling that at any moment they would be attacked themselves. His torch picked up something reflective in the dark, and he stooped to pick it up. Dog tags. They were printed with the name Sinner and his staff number. "Oh, God, no," he mumbled as his last hope disappeared. Then he shouted, an unnatural sound in the silence. "Sinner! Rohith!" No one answered. His voice died in the darkness. There was a trace of blood on the dog tags, and the chain had been severed. There was nothing else. No other sign that either soldier had ever been there. No weapons, no bodies, nothing. They checked outside and all around the store, but there was still no indication as to their whereabouts. The soldiers appeared to have vanished, spirited away for some dark purpose. Finally, Lewis turned to his men with a baffled look, and he repeated his question. "What the hell happened?" But there were no answers. They bunched closely and looked about them, feeling ever more vulnerable. "Boss, they're not here," Stradling murmured, not sounding his usual confident self. "We would have found them. We've searched everywhere. They wouldn't have just abandoned the Land Rover. Whatever has occurred, they're long gone." "They're dead," was all Bannister could manage as he peered into the darkness, voicing what they all believed. Millington just stood impassively as always, watching and waiting. I don't know what's happened, but we can do nothing for them, Lewis said, speaking quickly and quietly. I hate to go without finding any answers, but I think you're right. They're dead, and I suggest we get out of here fast before the same thing happens to us. Bannister nodded a little too enthusiastically. Abso-bloody-lutely. Swiftly they manoeuvred their tight huddle, rifles swinging wildly at every noise as they scurried back to vehicles. The keys were still in the ignition of the other Land Rover, so Bannister and Millington took it. With a remorseful glance towards the supermarket, Lewis got in as Stradling started the engine and floored the accelerator, whisking them back to the protection of the base. Safe. For the time being, at least.